According to the primary chronicle, sometime between the year 881 and 882, Oleg the Wise was able to seize control of the city of Kiev, a key trading city. Most point to this as the founding event of a confederation of principalities that would come to be known as Kievan Rus. Rus likely being translated from an Old Norse term used to describe men who row, which was the primary way of navigating the various river systems of the area. This new empire was powerful enough to demand tribute from some of its neighbors, and at least according to the primary chronicle's account, was able to effectively wage war with the powerful Byzantine Empire around 907. While many question how reliable a source the primary chronicle is, most agree that some sort of treaty was negotiated between Kievan Rus and the Byzantine Empire around that time, and that led to an extensive trade network emerging. Traders in Kievan Rus became wealthy selling furs, beeswax, honey, and slaves. In the beginning, Kiev was the largest and most powerful city in the empire, with its population growing to over 50,000 people, around triple the size of the second largest city of Novgorod. Kiev proved to be a central stop between Nordic settlements and Greece, and Kiev was also well located as a stop between Turkic Khazars and Germanic tribes of Central Europe. Around 980, the Grand Prince of Kiev, Vladimir the Great, converted to Christianity, but there are conflicting accounts as to why he converted. The primary chronicle includes a legend which said Vladimir sent out his most valued advisors to different parts of the world to decide what he should worship. In this account, they rejected Islam, in part because it prohibited the consumption of alcohol. They rejected Judaism because they believed the God of the Jews had failed to protect the Jewish Holy Land from conquest. They rejected the Roman Catholic Church because they thought the ceremonies were boring. But when they went to Constantinople, they were impressed by the Hagia Sophia and the church services there, and so they decided that would be the faith that Vladimir would follow. Arab sources tell another story, saying that after an attempted coup against Byzantine Emperor Basil II by two of his generals, Vladimir agreed to send troops to help restore the emperor in exchange for a marriage to the emperor's sister. But the emperor would only agree if Vladimir converted and also converted his people. After negotiating the deal, Vladimir sent 6,000 troops, and Emperor Basil returned to power. And most accounts agree that it was on his baptism to his new faith was around the same time as he married the Christian Byzantine princess. On his return to Kiev, he reportedly destroyed a number of statues to Slavic gods, and had the statue of the supreme god Perum thrown into the river. He then called for a mass baptism of the people of the city. Quote, "Rich and poor and beggars and slaves were called to come to the Dnieper River, lest they become, quote, prince's enemies." This event came to be known as the Baptism of Rus, and to commemorate the event, he had a stone church built, known as the Church of the Tithes. Although Kiev was the largest and most powerful city in the region, succession crises regularly led to divisions among the principalities. While conceptually the Grand Prince of Kiev was the de facto ruler, in practice infighting was a constant hindrance to influence and power. And being so closely tied to the Byzantine Empire trade systems put Kievan Rus in a precarious situation as that empire began to decline in power. As trade tended to shift north, cities like Novgorod became powerful enough that they no longer paid tribute to Kiev, using Baltic trade routes by sea instead of land routes along the rivers to the Black Sea. Over time, the succession crises reached the point that the empire was divided into as many as 12 principalities, which often found themselves in open conflict. Around 1169, Kiev itself was ransacked by a prince from a principality known as Vladimir Suzdal. When a European crusade sacked Constantinople in 1204, Kiev's value as a trade hub was severely damaged, which only increased fragmentation and further weakened the Grand Principality generally. In 1218, the Mongol Khan, Genghis Khan, sent a caravan to the Crimean Empire. When this caravan was seized, Genghis Khan became enraged and sent an expeditionary force to invade the empire. In just 3 years, the Crimean Empire was more or less decimated. Revenge accomplished, the Mongol forces then requested permission to expand the scope and turn toward what is now modern Georgia for general plundering. A letter was sent by the leader of the nomadic people known as the Khaman, asking for aid. The letter said, quote, "Today the Mongols have taken our land. Tomorrow they will take yours." The Grand Prince ignored the request, with his country having suffered raids from the Khamans in the past and likely thinking the problem was theirs. But as the Mongol forces moved closer to the Kievan Rus, he called for various princes to join an alliance to stop them. Hearing of this, the Mongol general sent a delegation of 10 envoys to assure the Rus that the Mongols were only interested in fighting the Kuman and had no quarrel with the Rus. The Mstislav of Kiev had the envoys executed. In May of 1223, Mongol forces attacked the coalition army of Kievan Rus at the Battle of the Kalka River. The Mongols soundly defeated the Rus and captured several nobles, including the Grand Prince of Kiev, Mstislav. The Mongols wrapped the prince and other nobles in felt rugs and stuffed them beneath the floorboards of an elaborate tent known as a gur. There, they were slowly crushed to death, while the Mongols drank and sang on the floor above them. Throughout Kievan Rus, there was a terror that the Mongols would now continue on, since their armies had been decimated. But this Mongol force had come primarily to raid and scout for future attacks, returning east rather than occupying any land. But the overwhelming victory both weakened the Rus and exposed the depth and weakness to the Mongols, who began preparations for a larger invasion to come. Although Genghis Khan died in 1227, a few years after his death, his grandson led a force west in 1235. By 1237, this force had reached some of the principalities of Kievan Rus. The Mongols once again sent envoys, this time demanding submission. There were attempts to give gifts as bribes, but they were unsuccessful. When the Mongols invaded from several directions at once, they burned many cities to the ground. One chronicle wrote, quote, "The Tatars took the town on December 21st. They likewise killed the prince and the Najanya, and the men, women, and children, monks, nuns, and priests, some by fire, some by the sword, and violated nuns, priests' wives, good women and girls in the presence of their mothers and sisters." When the Mongols began ransacking the cities of northern Rus, leaders of the cities began surrendering, including Novgorod, to avoid destruction. Mongol envoys were sent to Kiev to demand submission. However, these envoys were executed again by the Grand Prince. By November of 2040, the Mongols had surrounded Kiev, which still refused to surrender. A chronicler wrote of the siege, quote, "And nothing could be heard above the squeaking of his carts, the bawling of his innumerable camels, and the neighing of his herds of horses, and the land of Rus was full of enemies." On December 6th, the walls of the city were breached by the Mongols, and soon after the city was burned to the ground. Of the 50,000 inhabitants, it's estimated only about 2,000 survived the massacre. 6 years after the siege, a papal envoy traveling through Kiev wrote of the devastation, quote, "They attacked Russia, where they had made great havoc, destroying cities and fortresses and slaughtering men, and they had laid siege to Kiev, the capital of Russia. After they had besieged the city for a long time, they took it and put the inhabitants to death. When we were journeying through the lands, we came across countless skulls and bones of dead men lying on the ground." Kiev had been a very large and thickly populated town, but now had been reduced almost to nothing. For there are at the present time scarce 200 houses there, and the inhabitants are kept in complete slavery. The Grand Prince of Kiev, who had killed the envoys, fled long before Kiev was surrounded. Those who had claimed the city in his absence were killed in the sacking of the city. Yaroslav II of Novgorod, the city which submitted to the Mongols without a fight, was given the title of Grand Prince after traveling to Sarai to swear fealty to the Mongol Khan in 1243. Yaroslav died just a few years later in 1246, after being summoned again to the Mongol capital, where some believe he was poisoned. This made Yaroslav's son, Alexander Nevsky, Grand Prince. Unlike most conquering forces, the Mongols did little to assert cultural dominance, so long as those in the empire paid tribute and remained compliant. The Russian Orthodox Church was not only allowed to continue its practices, but arguably had more power and authority given to them by the Mongols than had come from the Grand Princes. The Khan reportedly wrote an edict that said, quote, "We don't require the church to pay any tribute, nor any tax per plow, nor any duty, nor provide horses, nor recruit, nor food supplies. Of all the Tsar's levies, we don't need any one from them." The heads of the church, more or less equivalent to Catholic bishops, were known as metropolitans. Through these metropolitans, the Mongols gave many governmental authorities. One edict stated, quote, "Let it have the power to investigate the truth and to administer justice, and to rule over its own people in all matters concerning robberies, theft, and all other cases. Let it be decided by the metropolitan himself, alone, or whomever he directs to do so." Novgorod and the Russian Orthodox Church also likely saw a threat coming from the west, as Catholic forces, who had been expanding into Lithuania, would certainly look for an opportunity to expand further into Novgorod. But as this land was now Mongol territory, with the help of the Mongols, Novgorod remained Russian Orthodox. Given all of these factors, not only were the Grand Prince Nevsky and Russian Orthodox Church willing to submit to Mongol rule, but Nevsky personally led a Mongol army to Novgorod to collect tribute from the city that they were refusing to pay. Their church did not praise the Mongols, but said they were a curse sent by God to punish the previous rulers for their infighting. But the church also heaped praise on princes who bent the knee, so to speak, to the Mongols, as they were sparing their people the misery that those who resisted suffered. When Nevsky died in 1263, despite leading Mongol forces against Novgorod to collect taxes for the Mongols 4 years prior, the church celebrated him as a hero to the point that he was eventually granted sainthood. Nevsky's youngest son Daniel inherited what at the time was described as a timber fort on the Moscow River after his father's death. Daniel was only recently born, and so he was given what was generally seen as the least valuable of his father's holdings, which was governed by his uncle until he came of age. While Daniel's brothers became entangled in the Mongol succession conflicts, Moscow began to grow in size and influence. By 1283, it was large enough to establish itself as its own Grand Duchy, separate from its prior subservience to the Principality of Vladimir. As one of the few locations not embroiled in Mongol succession wars, it also became a magnet for refugees. Daniel's oldest son Yuri became Prince of Moscow on his death in 1303, but wanted to claim the Grand Prince title because of the size and power of Moscow at the time. Yuri arranged for the murder of one of his other rivals, then received support from the Russian Orthodox Metropolitan of Moscow, Peter. With this support, he then traveled to meet with the Mongols in 1315 and spent 2 years making alliances, even marrying the sister of the Khan. As a result, the Mongols agreed to depose Yuri's uncle and make Yuri Grand Prince, functionally moving the capital to Moscow. Yuri returned with the Mongol army to assert his new power over his rivals, but he was defeated in battle, his brother and wife captured by his uncle's forces. When Yuri's wife died in captivity, Yuri claimed that his uncle poisoned her. The Mongol Khan demanded both princes be brought before him for trial, after which time Yuri's uncle was executed, cementing Yuri as the Grand Prince and functionally moving the capital officially to Moscow. But Yuri's claim was unpopular with the other princes, making it difficult for him to collect tribute for the Mongols. And the son of the uncle who Yuri had executed, a man named Dmitri, went to the Mongol capital and accused Yuri of stealing tribute from the Mongols. Yuri was summoned for the capital for trial, but was killed by Dmitri before any could occur. Yuri's brother Ivan then became Grand Prince. To test Ivan's loyalty, they required him to sack Tver, which had recently attempted to revolt, and to capture Alexander of Tver in exchange for keeping the Grand Prince title. Ivan was initially unable to capture Alexander of Tver, but he was able to convince the Russian Orthodox Church to excommunicate Alexander and anyone supporting him. Alexander agreed to the exile, reportedly saying, quote, "O my brothers and friends, let not this curse and excommunication be upon you because of me. I shall leave your city, and your oath to me and my oath to you shall no longer be valid." When Alexander died in 1331, Ivan traveled to the Mongol capital and was rewarded the Grand Prince title, setting the standard going forward that the Prince of Moscow was, for all intents and purposes, the Grand Prince. Around 1359, the Mongols' grip on power began to weaken. Internal conflicts led to divisions and civil wars that weakened their military power and influence. Kiev, and much of what is now modern Ukraine, joined the Duchy of Lithuania and were able to break free of Mongol control in 1362 after the Battle of Blue Waters. Lithuania would eventually merge with the Kingdom of Poland in 1569, but the area never returned to Mongol rule. It wasn't until 1380 that the Prince of Moscow, Dmitri of Moscow, was able to form an alliance powerful enough to defeat the Mongols at the Battle of Kulikovo. But the Khan returned in 1382 and burned Moscow to the ground, taking Dmitri's son hostage and demanding tribute increased dramatically. Dmitri was forced to negotiate an agreement with the Mongols, but it did make sure that his son succeeded him and that the Grand Principality of Moscow would officially follow family succession lines going forward. As the Mongols continued to fragment and lose territory, over time the Duchy of Moscow grew in power. Dmitri's great-grandson, Ivan III, later known as Ivan the Great, was able to not only defeat the Mongols in 1480 and gain independence, but he was able to take control of much of the territory that the Mongols had conquered. This included much of the territory that used to be northeastern Kievan Rus, including Novgorod. While locally he kept his title of Grand Prince, when dealing with foreign leaders, he would start referring to himself as Tsar. This was the title used for Slavic monarchs that derived from the Roman Caesars. Ivan the Great's grandson, who was also named Ivan, was the first to officially claim the title of Tsar as his title. This created the Tsardom of Russia from what had been previously the Grand Duchy of Moscow. This younger Ivan, who is better known in the West as Ivan the Terrible, began the westward expansion of the Russian Empire. Ivan the Terrible is not quite an accurate translation. One expert in Russian language wrote, quote, "His title should be translated as courageous, magnificent, magisterial, and keeping enemies in fear, but people in obedience." In addition to the expansion in the east, Ivan aggressively sought to take control of areas which were connected to Kievan Rus, but under the control of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania at the time. These included expeditions toward Kiev and what is now Crimea, but they were largely unsuccessful. He was far more successful with eastward expansion, reaching all the way to the outskirts of Siberia. When a Russian prince defected to aid the Lithuanians, Ivan implemented a policy known as opportuna, a term which was used to describe land left to the widow of a noble set aside for their children. He created a political police force of around 6,000 known as the Opochniki. The Opochniki targeted political rivals of the Tsar, seizing land from aristocrats, who they either publicly executed or expelled in the dead of winter with no means of travel, which was functionally the same as execution. Between January 2nd of 1570 and February 12th, the Opochniki detained and tortured anyone suspected of disloyalty or treason in Novgorod, often involving fire. Reportedly, women and children were tossed into the river, where they would become trapped under the ice, with soldiers pushing down anyone who might find a hole to escape. Others were expelled from the city, almost certain to die without shelter in the winter. Ivan then burned the fields, destroying an estimated 70% of the farmable land in the area, making it nearly impossible for Novgorod to recover to what previously had been a level on par with Moscow economically. This event has come to be known as the Massacre of Novgorod. Estimates were between 2,000 and 15,000 died, many personally supervised by Ivan himself. The economic system, specifically feudalism, meant there was very little recourse, as survival was difficult enough without having a revolution. There were few opportunities, and the serfs did not own the land, they were only renting the right to use it. Given the colder climates, having no land to grow food on or home to survive in the winter was all but a death sentence. Laws prevented serfs from moving, and in some places, laws only allowed movement for 2 weeks a year, a week before and after a holiday known as Yuri's Day, which was in late November. These laws eventually became more or less universal, and even the Yuri's Day exception was removed at one point, meaning a person was more or less forced to remain on the land they were born on until they died. This system also meant that the nobles were unlikely to challenge the Tsar, who they needed to protect them from uprisings of the serfs. But it also meant that the serfs had little motivation to do more than was required, as there was no hope to escape their conditions, and the lack of travel made it unlikely for any type of mass movement to form. A new culture began to emerge in what is now Crimea and southeastern Ukraine along the Black Sea, which came to be known as the Cossacks. The specific ethnic origins of the Cossacks are widely disputed, but the area where they emerged was unarguably a cultural melting pot, which had changed hands many times even before the Mongol conquests. The native people of the region would merge with serfs who were fleeing Russia and Lithuania, and eventually also with the nomadic Turkic and Mongol groups who had been left behind in the area, forming an entirely new group which helped also fight against the Mongols. Cossack in Turkic means free man, and the groups initially survived by hunting, fishing, and raiding. These raids were not organized by any of the major powers, they seeming to raid all of the neighbors, while claiming alliances to none of them. In 1539, the Grand Prince of Russia wrote to the Ottoman Sultan for help controlling the Cossacks. The Sultan wrote back, quote, "The Cossacks do not swear allegiance to me, and they live as they themselves please." 10 years later, the Byzantine Empire wrote to the Russian Tsar Ivan the Terrible, asking for help stopping the Cossacks in 1549. Ivan replied, quote, "The Cossacks of the Don are not my subjects, and they go to war or live in peace without my knowledge." Cossack raiders would use galleys to raid coastal cities and horses inland. They were known as fearsome warriors and often were hired as mercenaries. They were overwhelmingly Eastern Orthodox Christians, and so in addition to plunder, their raids would often focus on freeing Christian slaves, particularly from the Ottoman Empire. As the area occupied by the Cossacks expanded, many found themselves technically under the Duchy of Lithuania, with which Kiev was now part of. The duchy in 1569 had joined with the Kingdom of Poland to create the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but the Cossack raids of the Ottomans were always a source of tension, as the Ottomans supported a Crimean group known as the Tatars. The Tatars are a Turkic people who allied with the Mongols to form what came to be known as the Crimean Khanate. The Tatars would regularly engage in slave raids on Cossack lands, kidnapping tens of thousands a year to be sold into slavery from the Crimean slave markets. Our Ukrainian song lyrics describe the raids by saying, quote, "The fires are burning behind the river. The Tatars are dividing their captives. Our village is burnt and our property plundered. Old mother is sabred, and my dear is taken into captivity." While the Commonwealth and the Ottomans would make promises to reign in both sides, neither actually did much toward the goal, and so a low-level war between the groups simmered. After Ivan the Terrible's death, his son became Tsar. His son had no children and by most accounts was mentally incapable, depending on a regent to rule, and his death led to a succession crisis and a civil war. The start of the Civil War marked a long period of famine and social disorder, which is now known as the Time of Troubles. Likely sensing weakness in Russia, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth invaded under the pretext they were putting a secret child of Ivan onto the throne by the name of Dmitry. Polish-Lithuanian forces were able to reach Moscow, and on July 21st, 1605, this, quote, false Dmitry was crowned Tsar. Tsar Dmitry had converted to Catholicism in 1604, likely to keep Polish support, but this was seen as a betrayal by the Russians. Less than a year after being named Tsar, on May 6, 1606, he was killed by an armed mob in Moscow. This occurred just 10 days after his wedding to a Polish princess, and so there were over 400 wedding guests still in the city, who also found themselves murdered during the riots. One of the leaders of the assassinated riots crowned himself Tsar Vasily, but he lacked any claim to the throne and didn't have the actual support to rule effectively. In 1607, another false Dmitry appeared, again supported by Polish lords. Over time, there were as many as 10 separate people who claimed to be heirs to the throne. But rather than allowing the Polish to take control of Russia, the attempts to place a false Tsar unified hatred against both the Polish and the Catholics among the general population of Russia. The Polish army occupying Russia for most of this time mutinied over lack of payment and were pushed out of Moscow by Russian forces, which included Cossack reinforcements. The Russian parliament, which had generally just been a rubber stamp under Ivan the Terrible, now had the task of selecting the next Tsar. Eventually, a 16-year-old by the name of Mikhail Romanov was selected, becoming Tsar in 1613. Reportedly, he was selected because he was seen as easy to control, with one voter saying, quote, "Let's have Misha Romanov, for he is young and not yet wise. He will suit our purposes." Despite this perceived weakness, Romanov's reign was largely successful. Russia continued its eastward conquest of Siberia, reaching the Pacific Ocean, thanks in large part to Cossack mercenaries that were funded by the wealthy Stroganov family. and he was able to end wars with Sweden and Poland and get both to agree to cease challenges to his rule in exchange for land concessions. Outside of Russia, in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, in 1648 Cossack forces launched a rebellion for independence. They allied with their longtime enemies the Tatars against the Polish, with the Tatars agreeing to aid the Cossacks in the hopes that they would gain large number of Polish slaves. In just a few months, this uprising had occupied what is now most of modern Ukraine. Nobles, officials, and priests were captured or killed. Estimates are that as many as 1 million people died during the uprising, marking the beginning of the end of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, as its weakness began to be exploited by other neighbors. The Cossacks, seeking allies to make sure they could hold on to their land, entered into a treaty with the Russian Tsar, making an oath of allegiance in exchange for military protection in 1654. That same year, Tsar Alexei, Michael's son, invaded the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, starting the Russo-Polish War. This caused the Crimean Tatars to cease their alliance and begin raiding the Cossacks again. When the Russian military failed to come to protect the Cossacks, Cossack leaders viewed this as a breaking of the treaty. The leader of the Cossack uprising was a man by the name of Bohdan Khmelnytsky. He reportedly entered negotiations with Sweden, who had recently went to war with Russia, but before any deal could be reached, he died in 1657. His son Yuri was only 16 years old, and he was unable to unite the Cossacks as his father had. A civil war broke out over leadership, and in the end, the left bank of the Dnieper remained with Russia, while the right bank returned to the Polish-Lithuanians. But the existence of a Cossack state and a culture was a challenge to the Russian serfdom system, as the Cossacks were largely formed by those who escaped status and took up arms against it. When Tsar Peter I, later known as Peter the Great, took power, he allied with a Cossack leader by the name of Ivan Mazepa, in what became known as the Great Northern War with Sweden. Soon after, the Cossacks in the Polish-controlled regions rose up in rebellion, in which Mazepa joined in support with Peter's permission, reuniting the Cossacks as a Russian protectorate. But as Peter began to consolidate his military forces, Mazepa tried to change sides in the war and make an alliance with the Swedish, when Russia refused to come to his aid against a combined Polish and Swedish force. Outraged by this betrayal, Peter sent Russian forces to occupy the capital of the Cossack state, Baturin, before the Swedish army could arrive to reinforce it. When the city refused to surrender, it's estimated between 9,000 and 15,000 civilians, including women and children, were killed. A French historian wrote of the event, quote, "The city was taken and looted. What the soldiers could not take with them was the prey of the fire, which devoured even part of the city. The fortifications were completely destroyed, and the inhabitants of the city died, subjected to the most brutal torture. Some were put on stilts, others were hanged or quartered." Mazepa and his combined Swedish and Cossack forces lost at the Battle of Poltava, ending the dream of a fully independent Cossack state. The area was now a full protectorate of the Tsar, generally known as the Cossack Hetmanate. In 1721, Tsar Peter renamed the Tsardom of Moscow the Russian Empire. While Peter the Great is well known for many modernizations of Russia, he kept the Russian serf in their place, saying, quote, "Just as the landowner was to be tied to his service, the townsman to his trade or handicraft, so the peasant was tied to the land." He added new laws which required the serf to get permission from their landlord to even physically leave the estate they were bound to, and closed loopholes that allowed taxes on them to be tied to family rather than individuals. When in 1722, a leader in the Cossack region asked Peter to honor autonomy agreements, Peter had him imprisoned. Still, the Cossack Hetmanate was designated separately from Russia, and it had its own military force. This limited sovereignty was permitted by Peter's successors after his death until Catherine the Great took control of Russia and abolished the designation in 1764, incorporating the area and calling it, quote, Little Russia. Catherine wrote to the prosecutor general at the time, quote, "Little Russia, Livonia, and Finland are provinces governed by the privileges granted to them. Provinces are foreigners, and to treat them as foreign lands? It would be obvious nonsense. These provinces, as well as the Smolensk region, must be led by easy means to make them Russify, and stop watching wolves in the woods." In 1768, the Cossack military forces aided Russia in their war against the Ottoman Empire by sending forces into Crimea and into the Caucasus Mountains. In 1772, the old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was being partitioned after a previously planned invasion by Russia, Austria, and Germany on all sides, and this gave Russia more or less the whole of what is now modern Ukraine. But by 1775, the wars were won, and Catherine no longer needed the Cossack military. Russian military forces were ordered to surround the primary Cossack military headquarters, which caught the Cossacks completely by surprise, as most officers were trapped inside, while most soldiers were away at winter quarters. Her order stated, quote, "With this, we would like to let our empire and our faithful subjects be known that the Zaporozhian Sich is now destroyed, and the name of the Zaporozhian Cossacks is no more as well. mentioning of whom will be considered no less an affront to our imperial majesty for their deeds and insolence for disobeying the will of our imperial majesty. The leader of the Cossacks was arrested and sent into exile. The Cossack soldiers were forced to surrender their weapons to the Russian forces and abandon their fortifications. Reportedly, those who wanted to fight were told by the assembly, quote, "No, brother, we have parents and children. A Muscovite will cut them." All likely remember what Peter had done to the former capital years before. Some Cossacks fled to the Ottoman Empire, others to Austria, and some were sent to Siberia. Some remained loyal to the Russians and were granted land following another war between Russia and Turkey, which started in 1787 and lasted until 1797. The land became known as Ekaterinodar, which translated to Catherine's Gift. These became the Black Sea Cossacks, who would go on to serve the Russian military and from whom the bodyguards of the Tsar would often be chosen. When Catherine died in 1796, her son Paul, who by many accounts was mentally unstable, became Tsar. Paul's wife reportedly said of him, quote, "There is no one who does not daily remark on the disorder of his faculties." In 1801, Paul was assassinated. Most likely this event came with permission, if not the participation of his son Alexander, who then replaced him and ruled until 1825, during the Napoleonic Wars and Russia's expansion into Georgia. When Alexander died unexpectedly in 1825, his son Nicholas had to put down a military coup in order to take power. This event pushed Nicholas to become more aggressive in suppressing dissent and to create a spy network. It soon became a saying that, quote, "It was impossible to sneeze in one house before it is reported to the emperor." Nicholas began revoking local autonomy in some areas, including Poland, where in 1829 he crowned himself King of Poland, likely in response to the crackdown. In 1830, Polish forces removed local officials, and the Polish army unified in the insurrection against the Russians. This included parts of Lithuania and the right bank of Ukraine. But after a brief and bloody war, the Russians were able to put down the uprising, and this only further increased Russification efforts in the occupied regions. In Ukraine, efforts were made to repress the Ukrainian language and to pressure people into the Russian Orthodox Church. The Ukrainian poet Taras Shevchenko was famously exiled to Siberia for writing a poem mocking the Tsar and his wife. In 1853, the Crimean Peninsula became contested by an alliance of the French, the Ottomans, the English, and Sardinia, and this destabilized the entire region, leading to some peasant uprisings around Kiev. Tsar Nicholas died of pneumonia during the war in 1855, and his son Alexander II was left to clean up the mess. As part of the eventual negotiations, Russia was forced to concede various lands to the Ottoman Empire, and had to agree to largely abandon building a Black Sea fleet in exchange for keeping hold of most of the Crimean Peninsula. An estimated around 500,000 Russian troops were lost in the war. Nicholas' brother, Grand Duke Constantine, reportedly said of the war, quote, "We cannot deceive ourselves any longer. We must say that we are both weaker and poorer than the first-class powers, and furthermore poorer not only in the material terms, but in mental resources, especially in the matter of administration." Alexander II seemed to recognize the need for reform, seeing that the conscript army of peasants was not up to the task of winning modern wars, no matter how many bodies were thrown into battle. One of his advisors, Boris Chicherin, said of the Tsar, quote, "Called upon to execute one of the hardest tasks that can confront an autocratic ruler, to completely remodel the enormous state which had been exhausted to his care, to abolish an age-old order founded on slavery, to replace it with civic decency and freedom, to establish justice in a country which had never known the meaning of legality, to redesign the entire administration, to introduce freedom of the press in the context of an untrammeled authority, to call new forces to life at every turn and set them on firm legal foundations, to put a repressed and humiliated society on its feet, and to give it the chance to flex its muscles." In 1856, Alexander II gave a speech where he said, quote, "My intention is to abolish serfdom. You can yourself understand that the present order of owning souls cannot remain unchanged. It is better to abolish serfdom from above than to wait for that time when it starts to abolish itself from below. I ask you to think about the best way to carry this out." In 1858, he removed many censorship restrictions, calling for, quote, "glasnost," or open discussion. And in 1861, he followed through on his words and emancipated around 23 million Russian serfs, giving them citizenship rights that allowed them to marry without the consent of their landlord, to purchase the property they were living on through a repayment program, and even to start a business separate from their landlord. The nobles were unhappy, but they were also not in a position to resist, as roughly one-third of their property and two-thirds of the property they leased to the peasants were mortgaged to the state. And it should be noted that the serfs on state land were not given the same rights until 1866. But having freedom to leave didn't mean opportunities were plentiful. In 1866, the first railroad connecting Ukraine and Russia was built, meaning goods and workers could get back and forth. This was a huge boon to the area, as roughly 20% of the world's wheat at the time was grown in the Ukrainian steppes. In 1881, Alexander wrote in favor of a constitutional reform package, saying, quote, "I have given my approval, but I didn't hide myself from the fact that this is the first step toward a constitution." But before constitutional reforms could happen, he was assassinated in St. Petersburg. A group threw a bomb under his carriage, which exploded, killing one of his guards, but didn't harm him. Alexander got out of the carriage to survey what happened, and a second bomb was thrown. Following the assassination, his son Alexander III, who was a witness to his father's murder, abandoned the reforms and instituted efforts to put down dissidents and restrict civil liberties. He expanded Russification programs and allowed only the Russian language to be taught in schools in occupied territories. Between 1891 and 1892, a famine broke out that, combined with the cholera epidemic, led to the death of an estimated 375,000 to 400,000 people. The famine was made worse because, despite being aware of impending grain shortages, the government continued to export grain through August of 1891, a fact that led many to label the event the Tsar's famine, including author Leo Tolstoy, who was excommunicated from the Russian Orthodox Church as a result. Prime Minister Lord Salisbury described Alexander III's forest policy this way, saying, quote, "It is very difficult to come to any satisfactory conclusion as to the real objects of a Russian policy. I am more inclined to believe that there are none, that the emperor is really his own minister, and is so bad a minister that no consequent or coherent policy is pursued. But each influential person, military or civil, snatches from him its opportunity, offers the decisions which person at the moment wants, and the mutual effect of these decisions on each other is determined almost exclusively by chance." On Alexander III's death, his son Nicolas II became Tsar. Nicholas had also been present at his grandfather's assassination and had similar views with regard to the need to centralize power. When asked if he would consider giving more power to local councils, he reportedly said, quote, "I want everyone to know that I will devote all my strength to maintain, for the good of the whole nation, the principle of absolute autocracy, as firmly and as strongly as did my late lamented father." Russia's expansion in the east had brought them into conflict with Japan and China, and the debt from these conflicts increases Russia's dependence on French banks. This, along with concerns about German expansion, led the Tsar to form a Russian-French alliance. But the wars in the east were largely unsuccessful and unpopular, as was the increased repression of ethnic minorities and the recessions brought on by the debt. This was combined with the challenges of industrialization generally, and worker strikes became more frequent. In December of 1904, 150,000 went on strike in St. Petersburg. During a demonstration where protesters marched toward the Tsar's Winter Palace, ostensibly to deliver a petition, troops fired on the crowd as they approached the palace, causing between 200 and 1,000 casualties in an event that became known as Bloody Sunday. As news of the event traveled, many called for a general strike, and in January of 1905, over 400,000 workers in Russian-occupied Poland went on strike, with smaller strikes along the Baltic coast and in Russian-occupied Finland. Russian soldiers, angry over the failures in the wars in Japan and China, held mutinies, the most famous occurring on the battleship Potemkin. Facing an uprising that could likely include significant military support, the Tsar was forced to agree to reforms. A parliamentary system known as the Duma was formed, along with a new Russian constitution in 1906, but the reforms were limited as compared to other nations, leaving the Tsar control over cabinet-level positions. When World War I broke out, Russia's entry into the war was initially a source of unity, but soon the losses to German forces and huge casualties showed the incompetence of the Russian state once again. In St. Petersburg, which had been renamed Petrograd to sound less German, food and fuel shortages led to riots, and by February of 1917, the riots had grown to the point that the Tsar felt the need for military intervention. But when the Tsar called for troops to use force to stop the riots on March 11, 1917, not only did most of the troops refuse, many of them joined the rioters. Nicholas was forced to flee the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, and on March 15th, he abdicated the throne before being placed on house arrest. A provisional government was formed, which was made up of the former Duma representatives, but it required the support of a workers' council, which was known as the Petrograd Soviet, that had led the efforts that had removed the Tsar. The Petrograd Soviet was made up of socialist leaders elected by workers, and in theory was supposed to act more as an advisor, but in reality, the Soviet wielded great power, since the provisional government was unelected and made up of members of the old regime, and therefore lacked legitimacy. Initially, the Soviet declined to join the Provisional Government Assembly, seeing it represented the rich business class rather than the workers. But having two separate groups created complexity and confusion, and eventually the leaders of the Petrograd Soviet decided to work with them to form a Russian Republic in July of 1917. But while all this was going on, the area that is now Ukraine was on the front lines of the war, with parts of it under Austrian control and part under Russian. Ukrainian nationalists had long been mistreated by both countries and were often arrested if they promoted Ukrainian nationalist ideas. So when word of the Tsar being removed reached Kiev, Ukrainian nationalists seized the opportunity. They formed a local council to expand autonomy, and by June, these councils became formal declarations creating a Ukrainian People's Republic, which would become an autonomous region within the newly forming Russia. Soon after, the new republic was formally recognized by the provisional government, likely to assure Ukrainians would continue fighting with the Austrians and the Germans in the war. as the new Ukrainian State Council in Kiev issued a proclamation that said, quote, Ukraine should have the right to order their own lives in their own land. But while the provisional government was able to convince the Petrograd Soviet to work with them, that was not the only political movement with opinions on how the new state should be designed. Vladimir Lenin was a socialist leader who had been living in exile in Switzerland after publishing articles critical of the Tsar's government. German leaders, almost certainly hoping he would either destabilize Russia during the war, or even better, be able to take power and pull Russia out of the war entirely, aided Lenin in getting past German lines and into Russia. Once Lenin reached Russia, he advocated that all power should be given to the local Soviet workers' groups throughout the country, rather than having a centralized government at all, campaigning on the slogan, all power to the Soviets. He argued that there should be no cooperation with the provisional government, as it represented the rich and not the worker. He believed that Russia was, quote, passing from the first stage of the revolution, which, owing to the insufficient class consciousness and organization of the proletariat, placed power in the hands of the bourgeoisie, to its second stage, which must place power in the hands of the proletariat and the poorest sections of the peasants. Lenin promised, quote, abolition of the police, the army, and the bureaucracy, and that, quote, the salaries of all officials, all of whom are elective and displaceable at any time, not to exceed the average wage of a competent worker. He called for the confiscation of all landed estates and the, quote, nationalization of all lands in the country, the lands to be disposed of by the local Soviets of agricultural laborers and peasant deputies, the organization of separate Soviets of deputies and poor peasants, the setting up of a model farm on each of the large estates, ranging in size from 100 to 300 decinates, according to local and other conditions, and to the decisions of the local bodies, and under the control of the Soviets of agricultural laborers' deputies, and for the public account. He promised, quote, the immediate union of all banks in the country into a single national bank, and the institution of control over it by the Soviets of workers' deputies. As the war continued to rage on, and unrest spread generally, Lenin's Bolshevik Party, as an alternative, gained in popularity. When the provisional government ordered more troops to the front, violent protests broke out in St. Petersburg, and while Lenin and the Bolsheviks condemned the riots, several Bolshevik leaders were arrested and Lenin was forced to flee to Finland. But their anti-war position only made the party more popular. On October 10, 1917, the Petrograd Soviet, led by Lenin's ally Leon Trotsky, voted in favor of a military uprising against the provisional government. On October 25th, soldiers of the St. Petersburg Navy Yard rose in support of the Soviets, and by early morning October 26th, the group had taken control of the Winter Palace, which was the capital of Russia at the time. This soon led to civil war. In Ukraine, the new central government was challenged by Bolshevik workers' parties, which formed the Communist Party of Ukraine, creating a Soviet republic in eastern Ukraine and Odessa. They began arming and taking cities with the ultimate goal of reaching Kiev. Germany and the Central Powers saw an opportunity to ally with the new Ukrainian government, and together they were able to drive the Bolshevik forces out for the most part by the spring of 1918. But in April of 1918, the Germans supported a coup which removed the Ukrainian nationalist leaders and replaced them with a Ukrainian aristocrat who was given the name Hetman of all Ukraine, to harken back to the Cossack Hetmanate. But when the Germans had lost the war on the Western Front by November of 1918, they had no desire to stay and prop up the new Hetman that they put in power, and so the Germans and the Hetman left Ukraine, and a group connected to a prior Ukrainian government, known as the Directorate of Ukraine, was able to take power. In Russia, the war between the Red Bolsheviks of Lenin and the White forces of the counter-revolution who supported a centralized government was raging. The Bolshevik movement, now in a position where they were responsible for governing rather than just being radical outsiders, began trying to use violence and murder to eliminate dissent within the areas they controlled. Bolshevik leader Gregory Zianev wrote in 1918, quote, to overcome our enemies, we have to own our own socialist militarism. We must carry along with us 90 million of the 100 million Soviet Russian population. As for the rest, we have nothing to say to them. They must be annihilated. Alexander Berkman wrote of an attack on anarchist groups in April of 1918, stating, quote, of all the revolutionary elements in Russia, it is the anarchists who suffer the most ruthless and systematic persecution. Their suppression by the Bolsheviki began already in 1918, when in the month of April of that year, the communist government attacked, without provocation or warning, the anarchist club of Moscow, and by use of machine guns and artillery, liquidated the whole organization. These types of actions were not outliers in the movement. Lenin himself sent a telegram in August of 1918, which read, quote, comrades, the insurrection of 5 kulak districts should be ruthlessly suppressed. In the interest of the whole revolution, require this because the last decisive battle with the kulaks is now underway everywhere. An example must be made. Number 1, hang, absolutely hang in full view of the people, no fewer than 100 known kulaks, fat cats, bloodsuckers. Publish their names. Seize all grain from them. Designate hostages in accordance with yesterday's telegram. Do it in such a fashion that for hundreds of versts around the people see, tremble, know, shout, the blood-sucking kulaks are being strangled and will be strangled. Telegraph the receipt and implementation. Yours, Lenin. P.S. Find tougher people. A socialist leader who found herself in prison on the wrong side of the Bolsheviks wrote from her cell, quote, "Never in the most corruptive parliaments, never in the most venal papers of the capitalist society has hatred of opponents reached such heights of cynicism as your hatred. These nightly murders of unfettered, unarmed, helpless people, these secret shootings in the back, the unceremonious burial on the top of bodies, robbed to the very shirt, not always quite dead, often still groaning in a mass grave. What sort of terrorism is this? This cannot be called terrorism. In the course of Russian revolutionary history, the word terrorism did not merely connote revenge and intimidation, which were the very last things in its mind. No, the foremost aims of terrorism were to protest against tyranny, to awake a sense of value in the souls of the oppressed, to rouse the conscience of those who kept silent in the face of this submission. Moreover, the terrorist nearly always accompanied his deed by a voluntary sacrifice of his own liberty or life. Only in this way, it seems to me, could the terrorist acts of the revolutionary be justified. But where are these elements to be found in the cowardly Cheka, in the unbelievably moral poverty of its leaders? So far, the working classes have brought about the revolution under the unblemished red flag, which was red with their own blood. Their moral authority and sanction lay in their sufferings for the highest ideal of humanity. Belief in socialism is at the same time belief in a nobler future for humanity, a belief in goodness, truth, and beauty, in the abolition of the use of all kinds of force, in the brotherhood of the world. And now you have damaged this belief, which had inflamed the souls of the people as never before, at its very roots. When the war with Germany was over, the Bolshevik government renounced treaties it had previously signed that granted autonomy to the Eastern European countries. Bolshevik leader Leon Trotsky reportedly described the reasoning for why they were going back on the treaties as, quote, "No war, no peace." The Bolshevik Red Army surged into Ukraine, executing anyone seen as disloyal along the way. A group of historians documented the following list of executions, writing, quote, "In Kharkov, there were between 2,000 and 3,000 executions in February to June of 1919, and another 1,000 and 2,000 when the town was taken again in December of that year. In Rostov-on-Don, approximately 1,000 in January of 1920. In Odessa, 2,200 in May to August of 1919, then 1,500 to 3,000 between February of 1920 and February of 1921. In Kiev, at least 3,000 in February to August of 1919. In Executor, at least 3,000 between August 1920 and February of 1921. In Aravir, a small town in Kuban, between 2,000 and 3,000 in August to October of 1920. The list could go on and on. In Crimea, between 5,000 and 50,000 prisoners of war and civilians were executed on Lenin's order near the end of 1920, depending on which account you believe. This was reportedly after they had been promised amnesty if they surrendered. In 1922, the bloody civil war finally ended, with the Bolsheviks victorious, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was created and ruled by the Communist Party in Moscow. Soon after, the new Soviet state implemented a policy to integrate non-Russians into communist ideology by reaching out to ethnic groups in their own language and culture. The goal was to create groups of communist supporters of every nationality as a way to counter the problem that in many of these occupied areas they didn't want to be part of a Russian state. In Ukraine specifically, in July of 1923, a decree was issued stating, "On implementation of the Ukrainization of the educational and cultural institutions," and was followed by a second decree on implementation of the equal rights of the languages and the facilitation of the Ukrainian language. In 1925, a resolution passed with the goals of, quote, "solidifying the union of the peasantry with the working class," and a, quote, "complete Ukrainization of the Soviet apparatus." After Lenin's death in 1924, a 4-year power struggle ensued, after which Joseph Stalin was able to emerge as the leader of the Communist Party, and therefore the leader of the Soviet Union by 1928. Stalin did not agree with the efforts to create a Ukrainian version of communism, writing in 1926, quote, "Given the weakness of the indigenous communist cadres in Ukraine, this movement, led by a number of non-communist intellectuals, can in some places take on the character of a struggle for the alienation of Ukrainian culture and a public from the culture and public of all Soviet Union. The character of a struggle against Moscow in general, against Russians in general, against Russian culture and its highest achievement, against Leninism. I shall not prove that such a danger is becoming more and more real in Ukraine. I would only say even some Ukrainian communists are not free from such defects. Stalin implemented a 5-year plan, which included the state taking even more control of the land, specifically from relatively prosperous peasants known as kulaks. He claimed these farmers were hoarding grain and demanded these farmers give their grain to the state on harvest to then be redistributed. In 1929, he called for the, quote, liquidation of the kulaks as a class, and said, quote, now with the opportunity to carry out a resolute offensive against the kulaks, break the resistance, eliminate them as a class. He classified all kulaks into 3 categories: those to be shot or imprisoned, as decided by the local secret police, those to be sent to Siberia, the North, the Urals, or Kazakhstan after the confiscation of their property, and those to be evicted from their houses and used in labor colonies within their own districts. As a result of these policies, around 320,000 families were arrested. The government had set up agricultural collective farms, as well as state-run farms, ostensibly where peasants could go voluntarily. But realistically, given the threat of exile, it's questionable how voluntary the moves were. Estimates are 1.8 million people were deported between 1930 and 1931. By 1932, 62% of all agriculture was moved to these farms, but resistance was particularly high in Ukraine, which had large numbers of independent kulak farmers, given Ukraine was seen as the breadbasket of Russia. While the harvest of 1931 was lower than normal, Ukraine produced more than enough for its people. In September of 1932, Stalin wrote to 2 men he was appointing as special commissioners of grain collection in Ukraine, quote, the main thing is now Ukraine. Matters in Ukraine are extremely bad. Bad from the standpoint of the party line. They say that there are 2 oblasts of Ukraine where almost 50 party district committees have come out against the plan of grain procurement, considering them unrealistic. In other districts, they confirm no matter, no better. What does this look like? This is no party, but a parliament, a caricature of a parliament. Instead of directing the districts, Kossar is always waffling between the directives of the CC and the demands of the district party committees, and waffled to the end. Lenin was right when he said that the person who lacks the courage at the necessary moment to go against the current cannot be a real Bolshevik leader. Bad from the standpoint of the Soviet line, Chubar is no leader. Bad from the standpoint of the CPU. Brennan lacks the energy to direct the struggle with the counter-revolution by such a big and unique republic as Ukraine. If we do not now correct the situation in Ukraine, we could lose Ukraine. Consider that Pilsudski is not daydreaming, and that his agents in Russia are much stronger than the Redins or Kossar imagine. Also consider that the Ukrainian Communist Party, there are not a few, yes, a few rotten elements that are conscious or unconscious Pechoria adherents, and in the final analysis, agents of Podolsky. If the situation gets any worse, these elements won't hesitate to open a front within and outside the party against the party. Worst of all, the Ukrainian leadership doesn't see these dangers. Set yourself about the task of turning Ukraine into the shortest possible time in the fortress of the USSR, into the most inalienable republic. Don't worry about money for this purpose. In November, Ukraine specifically was ordered to provide 1/3 of the total grain for the entire Soviet Union. Starting on November 18, 1932, Ukrainian peasants were required to return excess grain they had been allowed to keep for meeting their production targets, and the police and party military officials actively searched to enforce. On November 20th, peasants who had failed to meet quotas had their livestock confiscated. On November 28th, collective farms that failed to meet quotas were blacklisted from receiving any food deliveries and were forced to give up 15 times their quota from the reserves they had kept to feed themselves, essentially dooming them to starvation. On December 5th, a declaration was issued stating that any resistance to these actions would be viewed as treason. In January of 1933, Stalin secretly sent a letter ordering the Ukrainian border to be sealed to prevent movement to other republics, titled, Preventing the Mass Exodus of Peasants Who Are Starving. It stated, quote, in the Kuban and Ukraine, a massive outflow of peasants for bread has begun, and that, quote, like the outflow from Ukraine last year was organized by the enemies of Soviet power. Approximately 190,000 were captured trying to escape starvation in Ukraine and forced to return to their villages. Even after quotas were fully met in January of 1933, the Russian government still enforced collection of additional grain. The government also restricted travel to the area to prevent news of the mass starvation from reaching the outside world, while also preventing potential relief from reaching the starving. With the grain taken and never returned, the mass starvation in Ukraine was rampant. In June of 1933, a Polish official in the city of Kharkiv wrote, there are dying people and corpses in the streets. Cars full of policemen drive around the city and pick up anyone suspiciously looking or poor. They are taken to barracks where, it is said, The completely emaciated ones are given lethal injections. In Kiev, another Polish official wrote, quote, "Over the past 3 weeks, corpses have been collected with ever-increasing frequency and speed." An aid agency in Berlin wrote in 1933, quote, "For more than 6 months, we have been trying to alleviate the terrible need by transferring food and money. Only with the greatest difficulties was it possible to obtain permission from the Russian authorities to provide aid at all. But even now, because of the prohibitive and constantly changing customs duties, no food parcels packed by private individuals can be sent to Russia. Only so-called standard parcels packed in Russia itself by the state trading company." A French newspaper wrote in July of 1933, quote, "At a time when the whole world is complaining about a crisis of overproduction, Russia is suffering from a terrible shortage. This shortage is even more substantial than in 1921, and its causes are not bad weather or drought, but solely the present regime. The results of its activity are appalling. Millions of people die every day from hunger. Whole villages are empty. All this is because on collective lands, ruled by ruthless bureaucrats, crops are organized very late or too poorly. For months now in Ukraine, one can find only bread made of wood bark and indigestible waste products." When any relief came, it was targeted toward the areas where wheat was needed to be grown for the next growing season, or where it was also more likely wheat had been kept, rather than where people were starving. With Stalin quoting Lenin when asked why, he said, quote, "He who does not work, neither shall he eat." Most tellingly of all, during all of this starvation, the central government continued to export over 1.5 million tons of grain a year. From Ukrainian ports specifically, in 1932, 988,000 tons of grain left the country. Government records also seem to indicate that the Soviet Union had kept a 1.141 million ton grain of emergency reserve during the summer of 1933, but declined to send it to Ukraine. In terms of global supply, not only was there no global food shortage, but instead, concern regarding wheat surpluses decreasing the price of wheat were written about. An American photographer named James Abbey was allowed to visit Ukraine under the conditions that he signed an affidavit stating, quote, they had seen no forced labor in the Ukraine. He reported, quote, only the actual industrial workers had received enough to eat, and even their families had suffered. When he went to the coal mines in Donetsk, he reported, quote, the next day we went into the question of forced labor. Of course, the armed soldiers situated in the mine shafts, powerhouses, and tipples had bayonets fastened to their rifles and a revolver strapped to their belts, but they were doubtless guarding the property, though the superintendent failed to tell us what they were guarding the mines against. Anyhow, the system of issuing and revoking food cards is far more sinister and effective than bayonets. After the massive number of deaths from starvation, there was a need to repopulate some of the farms, and so around 117,000 Russian peasants, loyal to the government who had been living in remote areas with less productive land, were brought in to resettle the now empty farms, mostly in what is now Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk oblasts. Holodomor, as this event is now widely known, comes from a joining of the Ukrainian words for hunger and plague, and can be translated as murder by hunger or starvation. There is wide disagreement on the number of deaths, with numbers ranging from 3.5 million to 10 million. No count was done at the time, and any reference to the event was illegal. In 1937, when a census was done with the intent of showing the success of Stalin's plan, the results were hidden, and many of those collecting the data were arrested and executed. Public discussions of the famine were banned in the Soviet Union until 1980, and even after the ban was lifted, the government continued to deny any famine occurred, sending out a press release in 1983 to every major newspaper in the world to protest the creation of a Holodomor monument in Canada. It wasn't until 1989 that the first book on the famine was allowed to be published in Ukraine. But according to the author, even then, quote, the most terrifying photographs were not approved for print, and their number was reduced from 1,500 to around 350. History is awkward.